Since this video is about parables, let's start with a story. Once upon a time, there was a man with the brain of a donkey. This donkey-brained man loved, and I mean loved, apples. Honeycrisp, Macintosh, Pink Lady, Golden Delicious, Granny Smith, it didn't matter. He loved them all. But he hated, and I mean hated, trees. Couldn't stand them. Couldn't stand the leaves, the bark, the roots. He hated trees so much that he chopped down every single tree on the entire planet. When people with normal brains pointed out to him the important fact that apples grow on trees, Mr. Donkey Brains replied, "Hee-haw! Not to worry. There are plenty of apples at the supermarket." So, after chopping down every tree in the world, he got his apples from the supermarket. Until the supermarket ran out of apples, because all the apple trees were gone. Then our donkey-brained friend spent the rest of his life moaning and wailing and screaming and crying and heeing and hawing, trying to figure out why there were no more apples. He couldn't understand that it was all his fault. He couldn't understand much of anything because he had the brain of a donkey. Who would have thought that one donkey-brained man could do so much damage to the world? You know how some stories have a moral, a lesson, a takeaway? Hold that thought while we talk about Professor Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins has spent decades attacking Christianity, and yet he prefers living in a Christian country and considers himself a cultural Christian.
We are culturally a Christian country. I call myself a cultural Christian. I love hymns and Christmas carols, and I sort of feel at home in the Christian ethos. I feel that we are a Christian country in that sense. I would not be happy if, for example, we lost all our cathedrals and our beautiful parish churches. So I count myself a cultural Christian. If I had to choose between Christianity and Islam, I choose Christianity every single time. I mean, it seems to me to be a fundamentally decent religion, insofar as Christianity can be seen as a bulwark against Islam. I think it's a very good thing. I mean, I find that I like to live in a culturally Christian country. In Africa, for example, where you have missionaries of both faiths operating. I'm on Team Christian side as far as that's concerned.
Nevertheless, even when he's right in the middle of proclaiming that he prefers living in a Christian country, even when he's right in the middle of declaring that he's a cultural Christian, he can't help but attack Christianity and state how happy he is that the number of people who believe in Christianity in the UK is declining.
It's true that statistically the number of people who actually believe in Christianity is going down, and I'm happy with that. I do not believe a single word of the Christian faith. I must emphasize that I think that the things that Christians believe are actually nonsense. Do you actually believe that Jesus had a virgin for a mother? Do you actually believe he rose from the dead? Do you believe that his mother was a virgin? I mean, today is Easter, and of course I don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead. I don't want to be misunderstood. I mean, I do think it's nonsense.
He loves the apples, but can't stand the apple tree. Speaking of trees, here's the parable of the mustard seed in Matthew 13. He, Jesus, put another parable before them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all seeds, but when it has grown, it is larger than all the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches." Jesus said these words in the first half of the 1st century. His followers were a tiny group of Jews in a tiny, seemingly insignificant province of the Roman Empire. But he said that the kingdom of heaven was like a mustard seed, a tiny little seed that grows until it becomes the size of a tree, so big that birds come and make nests in its branches. So, Christianity is going to start really small but become really big. That part's easy to understand. But what do the birds represent in the parable? Small seed becomes a big tree. Birds come and perch in the branches of the tree. What do the birds symbolize? There are two broad approaches to interpreting parables. You can treat a parable as an isolated story, ignore everything else, read the parable, and see what the message is. Or you can treat it as a story that's connected to other stories or other teachings in the Bible. As a quick example, the parable right after the parable of the mustard seed is the parable of the leaven. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour till it was all leavened. So, leaven is something that makes bread rise. You add a little leaven to the flour, the leaven works through the dough, and you end up with leavened bread. If you treat this parable as an isolated story, not connected to anything else, you'd probably interpret the flour as the world and the leaven as the gospel or the church spreading through the world. But if you connect this parable to the rest of the Bible, it means something totally different. Leaven usually symbolizes something negative in the New Testament, either false teachings, as when Jesus tells his followers to watch and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees, or sin, as when Paul warns the Corinthians that a little leaven leavens the whole lump. If you read the parable of the leaven in light of other Bible passages where leaven symbolizes something bad, you're probably going to interpret the parable differently. Instead of the leaven representing the gospel or the church and the flour or dough representing the world, you might conclude that the flour or dough represents the church and that the leaven represents sin or false teaching spreading into the church. So the message of the parable wouldn't be that the church is going to spread throughout the world. The message would be a warning that something bad is going to work its way into the church. Now, when you look at the parable of the leaven, you might think that the leaven can't represent something bad because Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like leaven. The kingdom is like leaven. How can leaven be something bad? But that's not how the parables work. The kingdom isn't like the first word that Jesus mentions. It's like the entire picture presented in the story. In other words, when Jesus says in Matthew 25, then the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins, he's not saying the kingdom of heaven is like 10 virgins. He's saying it's like what happens in the story. The story tells you something about the kingdom. So, when Jesus says, the kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour till it was all leavened, is he saying that Christianity or the church is going to spread throughout the world? Or is he warning his followers that something bad is going to work its way into the church? All depends on whether you take an isolated approach or an expanded approach. Full disclosure, I'm not opposed to the idea that both interpretations can be valid and that there can be multiple layers of meaning in a parable. There can be a surface level meaning and a deeper meaning. Jesus said that we're dealing with the secrets of the kingdom of heaven here. With this in mind, let's get back to those pesky birds in the parable of the mustard seed. The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all seeds, but when it has grown, it is larger than all the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. What do the birds represent? Isolating the parable from everything else, the birds don't have to represent anything. The birds could just be another way of emphasizing how big the mustard plant becomes. Or, keeping the parable isolated, if we want to say that the birds symbolize something, we could say that the birds symbolize people or groups that are going to find shelter in the kingdom of God. Along these lines, some commentators have suggested that the birds represent Gentiles entering the kingdom. But what happens if we don't treat the parable of the mustard seed as an isolated story? What if we look outside the parable for a clue about what the birds represent? Interestingly, Jesus talks about birds in another parable earlier in the same chapter, and he explains to his disciples what the birds there represent. The parable of the sower. That same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea, and great crowds gathered about him, so that he got into a boat and sat down. And the whole crowd stood on the beach, and he told them many things in parables, saying, A sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seeds fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured them. Jesus describes different types of soil and how different types of soil affect the growth of the grain. The path is hard from people walking on it, so the seeds never enter the soil, and birds come and devour them. Jesus goes on to explain this parable. He says, Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. This is what was sown along the path. So, the birds in the parable of the sower represent the forces of the evil one. The birds symbolize something bad, opposition to the gospel, something that snatches away the words of Jesus to keep people from understanding them. That's the immediate context of the parable of the mustard seed. We have the birds in the parable of the sower. A sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seeds fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured them. And then we have the birds in the parable of the mustard seed. The birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. If some of the negative meaning carries over from one parable to the other, and the birds in the parable of the mustard seed represent the forces of the evil one that snatch away the gospel before people can understand it, then this parable turns out to be a prophecy about the enemies of the kingdom. The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. The kingdom is going to begin as something extremely small, as Christianity did in the first century. It is the smallest of all seeds, but when it has grown, it is larger than all the garden plants and becomes a tree. The kingdom is going to become the biggest plant in the garden, as Christianity did when it grew and impacted the world, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. The kingdom is going to become so big, it's going to have such a massive impact on the world, that even its enemies, even those who oppose it, even those who can't stop attacking it, are going to be living in it. They're the ones who snatch away the gospel, but they're perched on the branches of the kingdom. The enemies of the gospel are going to feel quite at home in the kingdom. Where did Richard Dawkins say he feels at home?
I sort of feel at home in the Christian ethos. I feel that we are a Christian country in that sense.
And yet, he just can't stop snatching the seeds.
I must emphasize that I think that the things that Christians believe are actually nonsense. Do you actually believe that Jesus had a virgin for a mother? Do you actually believe he rose from the dead? Do you believe that his mother was a virgin?
He loves the apples, but hates the tree. He loves the fruit, but hates the root.
I do not believe a single word of the Christian faith.
Not even the parts that tell you all about the situation you're in right now, Professor Dawkins? So, Richard Dawkins and his followers are the smart ones in all of this. Just ask them, they'll tell you. Who are the dumb ones? People who follow Jesus, even though 2,000 years ago, Jesus predicted the very situation Richard Dawkins and his followers find themselves in. and Richard Dawkins and his followers can't figure out why the civilization they feel at home in is falling apart all around them, and they can't stop blasting away at the tree they're living in. The new atheists assured us that the more people turn away from Christianity, the more rational people will become. That was their prophecy. What actually happened? Well, the moment people in the West started turning away from Christianity in large numbers, the entire Western world started going completely insane. How can the new atheists be the smart ones when they can't even see the obvious? How can people who live in a tree think they're smart while chopping down the tree they live in? How can people who like apples think they're smart while declaring war on apple trees? How can people who live in a forest think they're smart when they've started a forest fire? We read multiple passages in Matthew 13, the parable of the sower, the parable of the mustard seed, and the parable of the leaven. But Jesus explained in the same chapter the spiritual blindness of people like Richard Dawkins and his followers. Jesus says, "This is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. Indeed, in their case, the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled that says, 'You will indeed hear, but never understand, and you will indeed see, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and with their ears they can barely hear, and their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and turn, and I would heal them.'" So, my atheist friends, how you like them apples?